And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Eschaton. If you're a new listener, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy what you hear on this podcast and that you'll recommend it to somebody else. For those of you who have been listening for some time, if you enjoy the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to promote the show and to get it out there into the ether for other people to find. So please take a moment to pause right now and just go and do that. It takes 10 seconds if you're listening on a mobile app, and it really does help. So thank you for those of you who have already done it, and thank you for those who are doing it now. I want to jump right into it today because this podcast is going to be a treat. This is a guest that some of you are familiar with. In fact, he was recommended to me by a couple of different listeners in the past. We were finally able to coordinate schedules and get together and record what you're about to hear. But this is a good one. As you'll see in the tagline to the podcast, this is the first guest who has ever given me cold chills. I think that's something worth noting because we do talk about some very interesting and intriguing things on this podcast, but this was different. This was something that I was not anticipating in terms of the direction that the conversation went, and I found the rabbit holes that we went down to be particularly intriguing and just overwhelming in a sense, which I don't want to give too much away right now, but stick around and you'll know what I'm talking about. But anyway, my guest is Laird Scranton. If you're not familiar with Laird, he's an author of a multitude of books. Laird really came to notoriety in the 90s when he began studying ancient myth, ancient language, and cosmology. He's particularly interested in the Dogon people of Africa. And we'll talk about that in the podcast, so I won't tip away too much of it right now. But if you're not familiar with Laird, I recommend that you go back to some of his earliest works in the Dogon people and just get an overview of that. He's also studied Chinese cosmology. His latest works are around the Ganeshas, an Indian myth. And this guy is just a well-rounded expert on many topics. But in any case, Laird started studying symbolism in the early 90s. He had a career as an independent software designer at that time, but through his wife, he began studying ancient culture and ancient mythology, and it just sent him into this whole new world of curiosities and research. And he began publishing books, as I said, in the early 90s. He's also been a lecturer at Colgate University in New York, near my old stomping grounds. So we had another point of similarity there. Laird lives in Albany, New York, state capital, and resides there with his wife. We'll talk a little bit about his bio during this discussion, but I will also link to some of his works, which you can find on Amazon, as well as any major bookseller. Barnes & Noble carries his works as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into this conversation. I don't want to waste any more time on the prelude. Laird Scranton is an interesting character. There may be things in this podcast, he just drops so many tidbits of knowledge that you need to pause, rewind, and listen to again. So take your time with this one. This isn't something you want to do while you're distracted with other work, because you will have a hard time keeping up if that's the setting that you find yourself in. So save this podcast for when you have some time to actually sit down and be attentive. You will not regret it if you do, and you're going to want to pick up some of Laird's work, so I'll be sure to link to them in the show notes. That's it for me on the front end, everybody. Take care. We'll get some more independent content out soon, which is kind of a step back from some of the interview content that we've been doing lately. So expect to see some more of that in the future. Until then, enjoy this episode. It's a really good one, guys, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody. Am I correct in understanding that you're in upstate New York?
Yes, I'm in Albany, New York, which is about 3 hours north of New York City.
Yeah, I grew up in the Finger Lakes.
Ah, right. Wow, that's great. That's a nice area.
It is, yeah. It's very rural and isolated. So I left for college. I went to Philadelphia, and now I live in the Poconos in northeastern Pennsylvania. But yeah, I grew up in a small town called Penn Yan on the north end of Keuka Lake. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I know Penn Yan. Sure.
Okay.
So, no, that's good.
Awesome. Well, thank you, first of all, for your time. I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with me.
Yeah, sure. Anytime. Happy to do it.
Awesome. You were recommended by one of my listeners who said, hey, you should reach out to this guy. He's got a wealth of knowledge and information, and be worthwhile guest. And I checked out some of your books online. I've ordered a couple, haven't had a chance to jump into them yet, but really fascinating topics, which right down the avenue of the things we discuss on this podcast. So I'm really interested in history, not only in an esoteric sense, but just in a general sense, especially like the age of antiquity. So Greco-Roman history, Egyptian history, anything in the Levant or the Mediterranean basin has always been of interest to me. But I didn't know anything about the Dogon people. So that's something I'm really looking forward to exploring with you a little bit, and kind of exploring how that ties in with mythology and just cultural practices at large in the ancient world. So I know you've done some research on China, the Ganeshas. We can get into that as well. But I'm really hoping we could kind of just do a survey of some of those hot spots and areas of expertise of yours.
Well, that's good. I'm currently working on a manuscript. One of my books is about an island called an island called Orkney Island, with a Neolithic village called Skara in northern Scotland.
Yeah.
But the indication is that the original settlers there came out of Anatolia through the Mediterranean. So I'm presently working on a manuscript that ties all that together. The traditional view there, no one has a traditional view on where they came from, but they're just such compelling connecting pieces. I'm having a lot of fun exploring it. Just ordered a couple of books on very early settlements, in Syria and places like that.
Awesome. What's your writing process like, if you don't mind me asking? Do you have a set timeline that you set for yourself, or a practice or a ritual each day?
No, I write as the mood strikes me, but that ends up being mostly every day. I always have maybe a half dozen different books that I'm reading at any given time, and any one of those might spark an idea, something to write about. You can imagine that the process of the studies ends up producing a larger conceptual stack of unanswerable questions than it produces answerable questions. And so what happens is, every so often the right piece falls into place, and now a book's worth of material comes out of that unanswered stack, and that's what I write.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're doing it. Somebody's got to do that hard work.
Well, I sort of accidentally wrote the first book.
Yeah.
I was just keeping notes for myself about what I was learning, and eventually had material organized for a book. All I had to do was sit down and write it.
Was that in the 90s, early 90s?
Yeah, in the 90s. Yeah, I self-published a book through Ex Libris called Hidden Meanings. And then eventually that book found John Anthony West, the Egyptologist. And he went to New York to a publisher's fair and personally shopped publishers for that book and for a second manuscript.
Yeah. I'd like to jump right into your work with what sent you down, this area of study. And well, let's start with the Dogon peoples. So what, turned you on to that part of the world? How did you learn about the Dogon peoples in Mali? And, what in particular is unique or, different about their history as opposed to, what we might expect?
Well, my wife, Risa, in the mid-90s, had read a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark. And every chapter in that book pertains to some mystery in the world that nobody has solved. And one of the chapters was about the Dogon tribe, and the concern was they seemed to know some things about astronomy they shouldn't know without telescopes. Like they knew that the Sirius star, which is a very bright star fairly near to us, the brightest star in the night sky, has a small dwarf star companion that is hidden in the glare of the bright star. And they knew the correct orbital period for the two stars. So the question was, how did they know that? And I decided that sounded like an interesting subject to research, that wherever it would lead would have to be an interesting place. And as I got down more and more into the studies of them, I realized the Dogon culture preserves ancient elements of three different traditions. They have civic traditions like ancient Egypt around 3000 BC. They have rituals like ancient Judaism, and they have a symbolic cosmology like ancient Buddhism. And a lot of it's expressed using what are arguably ancient Egyptian words. You can compare them predictively to Egyptian hieroglyphic words. There's no system of writing for the Dogon, but the words themselves carry the same meanings, similar pronunciation. So all of that opened up a bunch of doors for possibly figuring some things out.
Got it.
It turns out that the Sirius star information was probably the least exciting information that they convey. They say that their symbolic cosmology, which rests on Jung's archetypes, the archetype symbols and themes that Jung found everywhere. Their cosmology describes, according to them, how their tribal deity created matter. And I knew enough about that process to see that they had the definition of an atom right, and the definition of protons, electrons, and neutrons right, and they even drew a correct picture of an electron orbital. I thought, wow, if the top levels of this structure they describe are scientifically correct, what are the chances that all the descending levels they were carefully describing and diagramming were also correct?
Yeah.
So I started educating myself about that and discovered they have it all right from waves to atoms.
Really?
Correct drawings, correct relationship of stages, a correct outlook on what the stages represent. But they actually know it in a more complete form than we understand it. They have a clearer perspective on it than we do.
Yeah, so I guess the obvious question is how could that be possible without modern technological instruments? Do we have to suppose that their tribal deity somehow imparted the knowledge to them?
Well, the answer to that question, it comes out of comparative studies, which is what I do. All of these same elements are found in each of the major symbolic traditions of ancient times. And so you can triangulate in on the original meaning of any element of it by comparing how did the Buddhists understand this? How did the Kabbalists understand it? How did ancient Chinese understand the same element? Mm-hmm. And when you do those comparisons, what you discover is that the Dogon and the Buddhists managed to track the same symbolic system in comparable detail, but in entirely different languages. One is given in Sanskrit, the other one's given in what look like ancient Egyptian words, which means they didn't likely get it from each other. Neither one of them adopted it wholesale from the other because the words are different.
Yeah.
But they both have legitimate claim to being ancient.
Right.
So that means that each of them kept it straight, this very complicated system of symbols, straight for thousands of years down to the present day. The problem is that when you discuss those systems with modern authorities on the systems, they are in agreement with each other about things. Now, the Buddhists flatly say that their symbols, their most sacred symbols, were gifted to them by a non-human source. The Dogons say that it was non-human, but originally it was non-material. But they're both talking about actions that occurred in a material framework. Right. This is not like a shaman imagining something or dreaming something. Okay, now the problem that presented me with is it leaves me as a researcher with only two options. I can take the stance that both the Dogon and the Buddhists managed to keep all of the descending levels of their structure straight, but when it got down to the very last one, the question of who did I get it from, that they both somehow misremembered it in the same way. Yeah. That they didn't really get it from a non-human source, but they both imagined they did. Mm-hmm. Or I have to assume that they kept that last bit straight also, which means I have to allow the possibility they got it from a non-human source.
Right. It's interesting because it even indirectly parallels with other ancient stories that we know, right? Such as, the Anunnaki coming out of Mesopotamia, or the idea of, some of the apocryphal books of Hebrew scripture, such as Enoch talking about watchers or these entities bringing wisdom. We have, multitudes of cultures that talk about, the gods or visitors from another dimension. I've never heard of them being non-material. That's interesting. But they do seem to be deities or non-human, and that theme pops up in many cultures. And I'm wondering, could this just be a source of like the telephone game where everybody has this common form of ancestry, and the story kind of just took different shape as people spread out and the diaspora kind of happened and people migrated around the world? They tied it to their own, tribal myths.
Well, it looks to me like, the common symbols argue that they got it from a common source. Mm-hmm. Now you could, there are people who say, well, pyramids are an example of parallel development. That any culture who builds primarily out of stone is eventually going to stack them up and make a pyramid. There are only a few things you can do with stone. So that's probably coincidence. But what they don't notice is that there's very sophisticated symbolism that goes along with that form, no matter where we find it.
Exactly.
Whether we find it in the Americas or find it in Egypt. They imagine the pyramid as a woman lying on her back. It represents a womb. This is not incidental stuff. It's not stuff that accrues from stacking a stone up. So all of those indications are that these widespread groups got it from a single source. Now, whoever that source was, for that to be true, had a pretty broad reach, because many of these cultures were not understood to be able to have had contact with each other in very ancient times.
Right. Do you think it's a matter of modern archaeology or modern science maybe not being caught up to the reality of how these peoples may have interacted with each other? I mean, for example, we find discoveries as advancement in knowledge progresses of, trade, for example. Our understanding of how ancient cultures and tribal peoples traded with one another and the great vast differences to which they went to trade with other cultures makes me think that some of these stories could have also transmitted, maybe by sea travel or seafaring, being more ancient and more widespread than we thought, but also just on foot. There's rumors in Herodotus and other ancient historians that the Greeks knew of peoples in the relative Far East. I mean, way out in the steppes, at least. And this is way back, before many of them were even traveling on horseback. So I'm wondering if we're just not giving our ancestors enough credit in terms of how well traveled they were, or is there something more at play here?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, we have evidence that ships were traveling out to Gibraltar by around 7,000 BC. So there was capability of contact there that we might not be allowing to have happened. But my perspective is if you have some group in ancient times accurately talking about how waves turn into particles, that group's main difficulty is not going to be travel.
Right.
They're going to be quite capable of getting around anywhere they want to get. So from that perspective, the concern about how did they get it evaporates. Now, as far as it being non-materially originated, there is a perspective from which that also makes sense. My job as a researcher, okay, the way I protect myself from wishfulness, which is the biggest threat to the kind of work I do, it's the threat of chasing off after unicorns. You find something that looks like a resemblance, and you think there's a connection there, and it's not really there because the brain is wired to do that. But my first rule is we begin with flat statements on the part of the cultures. My job is then to verify that by comparing what other cultures think. But when we get down into the deep stuff, my job is to ask, is there any sensible perspective from which this could be a reasonable statement? Could they be telling us the truth? The idea of teachers who were originally non-material falls in that category. Is there any kind of a sensible perspective from which that could make sense? Well, in fact, the way they describe things, there is a perspective that works. This is all bases on an ancient philosophy, cosmological philosophy in India called Samkhya. All the religions in India are founded on Samkhya. Samkhya was a companion to yoga. Samkhya says that universes form in pairs, non-material and material, and that there is a flow of energy between the two universes, the cycle of energy between the two universes that they compare to the natural water cycle on Earth, where water evaporates from the ocean, creates clouds that rise up over the mountains, that produce rain that flows back to the sea. Without that cycle of water, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Well, the Dogen are saying without this cycle of energy between universes, there wouldn't be life in the universe. Now, the way the cycle works is it's not just energy that's cycling between the two universes, it's also mass. And so the effect ends up being one that's comparable to an hourglass, where you have sand shifting from the top glass into the bottom glass.
Right.
Now, as mass shifts from one side to the other, what you're doing is you're affecting the quickness or slowness of the time frame. Einstein says when a thing becomes more massive, its time frame slows down. So from that perspective, the essential difference between these two universes is how quick time runs. We get to the middle of the cycle, the middle of the half cycle. It's a 25,000 year full cycle. This is the Yuga cycle concept in Buddhism. About a 12,000 year half cycle. You get to the middle of that cycle, the mass of the two universes should have equalized. And at that point, you have a situation that is comparable to an airlock that allows a person to leave a spaceship or that allows a person to leave a submarine. If you can match the pressures of the two domains, then you can move from one to the other. The same concept applies to the two universes. If you can match the quickness of time frame of the two domains, it becomes possible to move from one to the other, which is what the Dogen said someone did.
So what you're talking about is effectively like a portal.
Right, a gateway.
A gateway.
And it's essentially what we see happen with UFOs, whose behavior seems distinctly dimensional. It seems that this is something that we're not seeing metal ships that seem to have come from someplace. We're seeing very strange objects that move in ways that normal objects shouldn't move. This is dimensional stuff.
Right.
So from the Dogen perspective, okay, now if you imagine this cycle of energy, if you compare it to the concept of a year, which the Buddhists do, they call it the Great Year, then the midpoint where those energies equalize would be the equinox of the year. Now, what happens at the equinox? Well, in ancient Egypt, the word for equinox was Kepler. Kepler is the dung beetle who represents the concept of non-existence coming into existence. Guess what? The equinox is the point at which that seems to be possible, according to the Dogen. Now, also at the equinox, in Judaism, you have a holiday called Passover. Now, a traditional Passover Seder, at the end of the Seder, they open a door to the outside of the room that they're sitting in to allow an imagined non-material being called Eliyahu to step in. They're physically acting out the thing that the Dogen are saying happens at the equinox. So wow. Lots of reason to think that this might actually be a true thing.
Yeah.
Now also, if you imagine that particles, the traditional perspective in science is that an act of perception causes a wave, which is essentially non-material, to collapse and create a particle, which is material. That perspective says that everything in our normal universe is the product of something non-material having moved into the range of materiality. So it's not like it's a radical concept. This is the way things work.
Yeah. So let's take the UFO example a little bit further, just as a potentiality here. So would this suppose that these portals or gateways are only operational at certain times? Because it seems like the UFO phenomena, well, for one, it's very somewhat modern, at least a modern understanding of it, and that's because of technology and phones and cameras and all that. But also, it doesn't seem seasonality. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like sporadic and very random.
Right. Well, I can't absolutely explain that, but there are perspectives that make sense to me with it. Okay. Time in the non-material sense. Okay, we have Buddhist geometry that describes what the relationship of space is to non-materiality and what the relationship of time is to non-materiality. And the way it's described, time on the non-material side is an oscillation. It's a back and forth. And it runs ultra quickly compared to ours because there's no mass. Time on our side is linear. These are functions of the way energy works. When energy spins, which creates an oscillation, that's called angular momentum, it evokes vectors that are perpendicular to the spinning energy, and the vectors are linear.
Yeah.
So there's an energetic perspective from which an oscillation of time could naturally convert to a vector of time, which is what we experience. Another metaphor to consider is, essentially on the non-material side, the way time works, all events occur effectively at once. This is the concept of quantum entanglement, where the essential thing that makes two particles look like they're one particle, from my point of view, is quickness of time frame. If you have an ultra quick time frame, the concept of distance disappears. We're proving that right now. we have an ultra quick connection between our two locations that makes distance moot. We could be in the same room, but we aren't. Speed up time enough, and you entangle things.
Right.
Okay. Now, so time on the non-material side compares to a CD in terms of being able to skip forward or backward to any song you want to hear on a CD. Time on the material side compares to a cassette tape. That if you didn't have a fast forward button, all you could do if you wanted to hear the fourth song on a cassette tape is listen through the first three songs until you get to the fourth one. It's linear.
Yeah.
So in that context, if on the non-material side it's possible to skip back and forth to any point in time you want to skip to, then the ability to come across into the material side might be immediate.
Yeah.
Wherever you are.
That makes perfect sense, actually. Interesting theory, huh? I'm gonna have to chew on that for a while. Huh. So, in a cosmic sense, like this equilibrium or the balance, you use the idea of like the sand in an hourglass. Would the Dogon or any other culture, have key markers on their calendar in terms of when these things? I mean, you mentioned the equinox, but is that the same across the board, or do other peoples have different time frames? Or
the reason we know it's the same across the board is because there's certain symbolism that relates to non-materiality and other symbolism that relates to materiality. Okay, for example, non-materiality is compared to the concept of unity. That's the entanglement I was just talking about. Whereas materiality relates to multiplicity. And so you have a circle, which is a one-sided figure, relate to non-materiality, and you have a square relate to materiality. Yeah. Well, over the course of this cycle of the shifting sands of time frame there, we went from being the less material universe to suddenly becoming the more material universe. What that means is that the symbols we were using to represent ourselves, to represent the Earth, needed to shift. The way to put that into context for yourself is, imagine you're taking a cross-country flight. Now, you get onto a plane with hundreds of other people who you probably don't know, and you may not talk to more than one or two of them. But by the time you get across the country, everyone on the plane knows to shift their watches by 3 hours. Mm-hmm. It's not because anybody told them to do it. It's because they understand that's how time works, how time zones work.
Right.
Well, around the world, at around 3000 BC, you have cultures all over the world that are supposedly not in contact with each other, shifting from matriarchy to patriarchy. Matriarchy is symbolic of the non-material. Patriarchy is symbolic of the material. You have a host of other symbols, even concepts of going from oral language to written language is a reversal in symbolism. You have item after item that not just in one culture, but in widespread cultures, all shift in the same era, in the same way. Mm-hmm. So that says that they all experience the same equinox. They all recognize where that equinox is. They measure it the same way, and they're counting from the same moment. The Hebrew calendar is approaching 6,000 years old. 6,000 years is the half cycle or a quarter cycle of the energy I'm talking about. So essentially, the Hebrew calendar measures from the equinox of this great year to where we are right now.
6,000 quarter cycle or a half cycle, you said?
A quarter cycle. The half cycle is about 12,000 years.
Okay.
The current Hebrew year is someplace past 5779. It's approximately 6,000 years.
Interesting. And the idea of, ziggurats, pyramids, so many of these ancient structures being kind of focused around the equinox, for the sun to rise in a certain way. You have the coiled serpent in Latin America, where the serpent actually, you see it descend or ascend up the stairs on the equinox.
Right.
To me, that just shouts that there is an ancient piece of wisdom or knowledge that we have either lost or just kind of brushed aside, or maybe not bothered to look too deeply into, but it seems to be the core framework of these societies. Like, it's at the fundamental level of what they understood to be the nature of reality.
Right. Now, understand that a serpent is symbolic of the swirling energy. And so to have the serpent take motion at the equinox is a way of representing the thing I'm talking about.
Yeah. So for you and I in the material side, is there, and this is kind of getting into like a more mystic or esoteric realm, but is there a way for us in reverse to kind of move into that non-material? Like what would that look like if you and I were to take on that expedition on the equinox?
What it would look like to us is the same thing as we experience when we're underwater. Imagine yourself in a swimming pool looking up at the surface of the water. That's how non-materiality would be experienced by us. That based on the sources I have, that's how it would be experienced.
I just got to interject for a second. That gave me cold chills because there's no way you could have known this. But I had a gentleman on, a researcher. He's from New England. His name is Jim Vieira. And Jim's really interested in ancient cultures, particularly around mythology and belief systems. And he was on recently, and we had a conversation about plant medicine. We were talking about ancient culture practices with like psilocybin or mushrooms and iboga and all these plant medicines that grow around the world, and whether or not that may have had an influence on the framework of their cultural beliefs. And anyway, I talked about an experience I had with psilocybin, and the way I described it to Jim was as if I was standing on one side of a waterfall, and I could hear people around me, and I could observe them around me, but it's like a waterfall was between us. I used that same analogy you did with water,
right?
And material to non-material, and it gave me cold chills when you said that, because that's almost exactly what I experienced with the plant medicine. Yeah.
Now, the dynamic across the boundary from the non-material to the material is a 1-to-8 relationship. The way to conceptualize that is white light producing a rainbow of colors, or vibration producing 8 notes of music.
Wow.
Anything that goes from 1 to 8, we can infer crosses that boundary of the non-material to the material. Now, one of the things that does that is ancient Egyptian cosmological words. Each cosmological term carries a cluster of meanings, not a single meaning. And those meanings are logically distanced from each other, so if you know one meaning, you can't guess the other ones. And those clusters hold true from culture to culture and language to language. They float with the concepts, not the phonetics.
Got it.
But it's interesting that UFO experiences follow that same pattern. I'll give you an example. There's a UFO case where a woman steps out on her front porch and she notices 3 gray aliens who don't know she's there. And then suddenly they notice her and they turn quickly to leave, but when they leave, she doesn't see 3 gray aliens leave, she sees 3 deer leave.
Huh.
Well, the Egyptian word that means to depart in haste also means deer. Now, I've tracked any number of these with cases, documented by people like Bud Hopkins and John Mack, and consistently, what the person describes as their experience, what they're strongly feeling or what they're seeing, at the time they're also describing a UFO entity taking a certain action. Yeah. You go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and they play out as clusters of the same phonetic value.
Wow. That kind of opens the door to all these ancient accounts of shape-shifting as well. Native culture really is big on that. But this idea of entities from non-local places taking on the identity of another creature, maybe in haste or maybe just to be in disguise. But that's interesting.
So it's lots of interesting stuff connect here.
Yeah. Wow, this is not the direction I thought this conversation was going to go, but this is fascinating. Literally, I can't remember the last time somebody gave me cold chills on this podcast. But
well, so what happens to me is that sort of out of the blue, pieces fall into my lap, and I sit down and I end up writing a book out about it, and that ends up leading me on to other things. For me, myself, it's pretty transparent for me. I never really considered myself to be connected in any spiritual or non-material way growing up. At 18, I would have described myself as the least spiritually connected person I knew, probably.
Yeah.
But the way it works is, according to Samkhya, what's happening is that the cycle of energy is causing one universe, causing their time frame to quicken to the point that they no longer have a moment to take action.
Yeah.
They have complete consciousness, but no moment to take action. Now, for a person, there is a state that compares to that. It's called locked-in syndrome. There was a book written and a film a few years back called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. It was written by a Frenchman who had suffered a heart attack at the wheel of his car and had a stroke and an accident, and they thought he was brain dead, and they took him home to care for him, because in France they don't just let the person die. All he could do was blink his eyes, and they thought they were just random blinks. But one of his aides paid attention and figured out that there was a pattern to his blinks. And so she worked out a system with him to indicate a letter through blinks. She would step through the alphabet, and he would blink at the point he wanted to indicate a letter. And he ended up writing this entire book one letter at a time to her. Wow. Well, Samke's view is that that's what's happening to the non-material universe, that they realize about a third of the way into the process that where the trend is heading is to them being locked in a situation where they have full consciousness, but they can't do anything. It's a horrific state to be in if nobody knows you're there. So the goal, it's not a horrific state if you have a companion or a compatriot who can help you out, who knows you're there, who can act on your behalf. Well, the only potential compatriot that the non-material universe has is the material universe.
Right.
So about a third of the way into the cycle, they start, the problem on the material side is, as energy increases and our time frame shifts, we become less and less able to detect that the non-material is even there. This is Yuga cycle concept. So at the point where they're going to be locked in, we're going to be furthest removed from even knowing they're there.
Yeah.
So the non-material takes action to create a structure for society that will guarantee that at the point where they're locked in, we still remember they're there. Trying to create a stable structure for the symbolic system and a related civic plan, a stable structure for society, so that there's a hope that at the point where they need us to be their compatriot, we have a memory of the fact that they're there.
Got it. Wow. So in terms of this relationship, this duality, I guess, between the material and the non-material, I mean, you said Buddhism has kind of a similar framework of understanding about this idea as well. That's a I guess atheistic, but a non-deistic belief system. So where would they say, what was the primordial or the progenesis of the creation of the material?
Okay, Samkhya. First of all, Samkhya, the ancient philosophy this is all based on, is also non-theistic, but it spawned theistic traditions. Beyond that, the critical question came down to the way we experience reality. An act of perception causes a wave to collapse and create a particle. So, tracing that back, the later philosophies were saying, well, look, how could this have possibly begun if there wasn't something or someone to make that initial act of perception? There must be a God.
Right.
We need a God to perform that initial act of perception in order to get the whole thing started.
Yeah, prime mover, first cause.
Right. Samkhya says, no, that's not true. If you have a self-aware consciousness, it can self-perceive. So what Samkhya describes, and what Kabbalism explicitly agrees with, the Dogon explicitly agree with, and other cultures agree with also, is the concept that these two universes together constitute a consciousness, an intelligence. It's what the Bon tradition, Tibetan Bon religion refers to as the mind itself. It's pure consciousness.
So does that suppose an eternal universe at some point? Or, I mean, to me, it's like the chicken and the egg question.
Right. What it supposes is that this root dynamic of energy, which is an oscillation, is also the root dynamic of consciousness. Again, a way to think about that, if you close one eye, you realize that you see things in 2 dimensions. It's a flat image. All it takes to see it in 3 dimensions is to open the second eye, have a second perspective on the same thing, and suddenly you automatically get a 3-dimensional perspective. Well, the same thing seems to be true about consciousness. That as soon as you have 2 perspectives on the thing, one of overview and one of detail, you automatically get a potential for consciousness. So the idea is that the root dynamic of energy, which is this oscillation, automatically provides the potential for consciousness.
That sounds like one that could be a philosophy book on its own. I mean, I'm sure it is, but I have to think about that.
Yes. Now, a lot of the ancient traditions say that that root consciousness is unknowable by humanity. It's so abstract that humanity can't know it.
Yeah.
But that's not actually the way I understand it based on the studies I've done. That human understanding is framed in a way, okay, imagine an optical illusion. You may have seen the optical illusion of the faces and the vases and the face. The faces and the vase. The two faces that are identical create a sort of a shadow image that takes the shape of a vase.
Mm-hmm.
Now, human consciousness is such that we can only focus on one of those images at a time. We can't be directly focused on both at the same time. Our consciousness flips back and forth as we try to picture one or picture the other. That's what Tibetan Bon religion means when it says that the root consciousness is unknowable. We can't grasp it all at one take. But we're perfectly capable of understanding the dynamic that causes it. So in Buddhism, in exoteric Buddhism, which is the public Buddhism, they say, look, all this stuff is fundamentally unknowable. You get to esoteric Buddhism and they say, well, that's one of the things we fibbed about. In fact, it's entirely knowable. It rests on a handful of dynamics of energy that the Dogen lay out for us. And if you understand those dynamics, they play out in similar form on scales all the way up the range from quantum world to the world of universes to beyond that.
So we can use the Dogon as an example, but any culture will suffice, I guess. What would be the telos or the purpose, the goal for the non-material to come into the material? Like, why?
That's what I was just describing as the knowledge that they were headed to being locked in. Now the thing is that this is a cycle. There's this descending half cycle where things get more material, and there's an ascending half cycle where things get less material. And as part of that cycle, the roles of the two universes flip. So each universe is ultimately going to go through that stage where it's locked in, which is like being buried alive, and needs a companion. And so the motivation comes out of what's called a covenant. It's a covenant between the two universes, and understanding that we're all the other universe has, it's our job to play our role in this so that when we get to the point where one of us needs the other, we have a caretaker.
What did the Dogon believe about our relationship with the afterlife, our consciousness and our energy? Did they believe that we continued on in some sense?
Well, let me explain to you how space works. Okay, where are you located right now?
I'm in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Okay, so if I wanted to travel from Albany to northeastern Pennsylvania, there's a distance involved. The distance is a constant. How I get there isn't a constant. I can get there on foot, and it'll take me a long period of time to get there. I can ride a bicycle and get there quicker. I can drive a car and get there quicker. I can take a plane and get there quicker. I can take a jet plane and get there quicker. Right. The distance doesn't change just because I get there in quicker time. Even with our internet connection, which is instantaneous, the distance didn't change. It's still the same.
Right.
The thing is that the quicker the connection is, the less pertinence that space has. So when we look at the non-material from our perspective, if you think that the fundamental difference is quickness of time frame, concepts of space still apply, but they are no longer pertinent because the time frame is so ultra quick compared to ours that it looks to us as if everything's one thing. Okay, now consciousness works the same way. There is parallelism between between cosmology and biology. So if you imagine that consciousness inherently lives on the non-material side, that individual consciousness is a subdivision of grand consciousness the same way that individual particles are a division of a grand source, then our existence compares to a television show you're streaming. That television show, when that television show ends, nothing has really ended because the show doesn't persist, doesn't exist in your streaming of it. It exists outside of your streaming of it. And it's still an independent, coherent thing. Just because you turned it off doesn't mean that somebody else can't then go turn it on. It still exists as an independent thing. So consciousness works the same way, or seems to work the same way, that individual consciousness still exists on the non-material side, but time runs so quickly that there's no difference between one consciousness and the next consciousness. It's all one thing.
Yeah, that's the part that's tough to get your head around. Like this individuality, the individual human experience that I'm perceiving right now. I feel it. It's all around me. I observe it through the eyes of one observer, but it seems like there's a finality to that when your life ends, when your heartbeat stops. But yet your consciousness, this thing that is your core, some people might say soul, but this idea of, this core essence of your energy, your being, your life force, seems like that can't be destroyed. But how? I guess my question is, and I'm curious to know what other cultures think about this. I come from a Judeo-Christian background, and that's how I was raised. So I wonder, I've always questioned that idea, this idea of the soul. You continue on more or less as your same self in the afterlife. To me, that seems too simplistic. It seems like there's a more complex relationship or understanding of the true self, I guess, that and what it is that actually continues on, if anything continues on after this experience of life has come to an end. That's the part that's always been interesting and confounding to me, is how much of the true self is the individual human experience and how much of it is something deeper below the surface.
Well, one way of, again, intuitively understanding or getting some insight into that is if you cross your index and middle finger and grab a pencil and close your eyes and run the pencil between the two fingers, you can convince yourself that there are two pencils there.
Really? I'm going to have to do that now. You know that, right?
Okay. Yeah. Now, you'll get the distinct impression that there are two pencils there. You really can't, the brain can't distinguish between two pencils, one on each side of the two fingers, or one pencil between the two fingers.
Where's my damn pencil?
Now, that'll give you some insight into how a life experience that doesn't have ultimate reality to it can seem like it does.
Oh my God, you're right. I'm doing it right now.
Okay. Part of my job is trying to find intuitive metaphors to bring this down to that will communicate an idea to somebody in a way that they grasp immediately, even though it's complicated.
Yeah. One
thing being like another. I understand thing A. I don't understand thing B. If I can tell you that they're the same, you grasp thing B. So anyway, now the Dogen outlook on that is a little bit more complicated. They say that a person has 4 souls. Now,
wow.
That says to me that consciousness has dimensionality to it, because we live in 4 dimensions. And they say that when a person dies, that one of those souls has the option to stay on and look out for people that cares about. And that the purpose of a funeral is to convince that soul that things are so good here without it being here, things will go on in such good shape that it doesn't need to bother itself with that. It can move on.
Yeah.
Now, a certain number of those souls decide they can't move on. And so what the Dogen do is every so often, they'll hold a generic funeral for these souls that are still connected to reality to give them another opportunity to decide that they want to move on.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I've never heard of the 4 before. I mean, I'm familiar with the trichotomy idea, this idea of body, soul, and spirit, and somehow having a distinction between the soul and the spirit. One might stay. People have even tied that into like ghostly apparitions and that phenomena, and then the idea of the soul being separate from the spirit. But 4, I've never heard of anything like that before.
Well, now things that come in 3s, for me, relate to this concept of the oscillation of energy on the non-material side. Mm-hmm. It's the apparent motion of the sun from the solstice to the equinox to the next solstice. There are 3 stages to that,
right.
And it oscillates back and forth. It also relates to concepts in Buddhism of ascension, which are expressed in relation to three stages. Buddhist concepts, it's a little bit complicated. With matter, when you get down to the root of matter, you have 2 qualities of energy that are interacting with each other. One is we can think of as being magnetism, which looks like a 2-dimensional energy to me. And the other is electricity, which looks like a 3-dimensional energy to me. And when those 2 come together, anytime 2 qualities of energy come together that are two energies come together that are of differing quality, they tend to spin. What they do is they create sort of an almond shape, and then around that almond shape they end up spinning. Okay, now that almond shape ends up being the gateway at the quantum level between the non-material and the material. We know it exists because we have particles whose symmetry is odd. We have certain kinds of fundamental particles where they look the same from all sides. Another kind of particle that you have to turn halfway around, like a double-sided arrow, to look the same. We have a third kind of particle that has to be turned all the way around to look the same, like a single-pointed arrow. But we have a fourth kind of particle that has to be turned around twice to look the same. Now, in four-dimensional reality as we experience it, that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have a particle that has to be turned around twice in order to look the same.
Right.
And so the suggestion is that it passes into and out of a non-material domain. So at one point I asked myself, I wonder if there's geometry associated with that kind of a particle that I could look at. Does it relate to a particular geometric figure? And it turns out it does. And that figure is the same geometry that the Buddhists use to align a Buddhist stupa to the cardinal points. It's the same geometry that Islam uses to align shrines. China uses it. The Dogon use it. All sorts of cultures use it. This is fundamental stuff. It's the first concept that's taught to a Buddhist initiate, is to memorize this geometry, because this is, according to Buddhism, this replicates how space emerges. What they don't tell you is that it also replicates how time emerges. It takes a little more experience with the symbolic references to get the fact that they're referring to both at the same time. Those two concepts relate to each other the same way that bread dough that rises. As the bread dough rises, it expands in all directions at once. That's a metaphor for how space and time emerge. And my outlook is that the dynamics of space are already there under the covers, and all that's happening is that as time slows down, that distance, that space, is something we more and more have to deal with. At ultra quick time frames, it doesn't matter to us. It's internet connection.
Yeah.
Slow it down. I'm sure you remember back in the day when you had a slow computer and certain screens would fill in sections, not all at once. That's the effect of a slower time frame.
So basically, it's like landline internet.
Right, landline internet. That's right.
Wow, we're already coming up on an hour. I want to keep this somewhat digestible in length, but we haven't even gotten to your latest work yet around the Ganesha. So I wanted to kind of open it up and talk about what you're working on now in your latest research.
Well, the Ganesha book is one I've wanted to write for a long time. Over time, I was gaining more and more of a sense that there were important connections to Ganesha in Hinduism. As it turns out, there's a well-known Yale professor named Phyllis Granoff, who wrote a very well-known article about Ganesha called Ganesha as Metaphor. And in that article, she's talking about a Sanskrit text called the Madgala Purana. It's a text that is devoted to concepts about Ganesha, but it's never been translated into English. It's only in Sanskrit. So she can see, studying it, that there are 8 incarnations of Ganesha that the text represents as progressive stages of creation. She understands that. The problem is she doesn't have a context in which to grasp what they're talking about. Well, the Dogon provide that context. They talk about a fundamental spiral of matter it forms in 8 stages. And they can represent that figure one of 2 ways. One of the ways of representing it is as rays of a star of increasing length that emerge from a center. So it's and they take that star. It's actually 7 rays of a star. There's an 8th stage that's a conceptual stage where the last ray bursts a bubble. They anthropomorphize those rays by making it into a stick figure. They consider the top 2 rays to be a head, and then there are 2 ways they anthropomorphize it. They turn it into a figure. Consider the next 4 rays to be 2 arms and 2 legs, and the last ray to be a tusk. Or they conceptualize the next 4 rays as being arms and the last ray as being a single leg that the figure dances on. This is Ganesha symbolism.
Interesting.
And even the Dogon terms for the figure relate to Sanskrit terms that apply to Ganesha. So there's a connection here that the Dogon symbolism is 3,000 years older than the symbolism in India, but it's all the same stuff, and it provides the basic mindset that Ganesha relates to. And so I wanted to write that. I wanted to put that all down in a book. Ganesha ends up tying to all of the root dynamics of energy that I said, if you understand those, you understand how the universe works.
Yeah.
So anyway, I had wanted to put that down in the form of a book. I ended up self-publishing it recently. The next book I'm working on, I have one at the publisher called The Plan of the Ancient Cosmology. This is with Inner Traditions. That'll be out sometime next year. That talks about the mindset of the teachers who I see, the group I see as the teachers who put this system together, and some of the choices they had to make about how to put it together, why they did it in particular ways. There's a logic to it. There's a rationale to it.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I'm presently working on is a manuscript that's a follow-on to a book about northern Scotland, and it ties much earlier traditions that come out of ancient Turkey to northern Scotland in a way that researchers in northern Scotland haven't put together yet.
Where can people go to learn about your past works or pick up copies and learn about your research?
Well, my immediate publisher is Inner Tradition, so I have an author page with innertraditions.com. They're a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster, so I also have an author page at simonandschuster.com. Okay. But my books are available pretty much anywhere. You'll likely to find some of them on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. You can order them off Amazon worldwide. Okay. Finding me personally, the easiest way to find me personally is on Facebook. I'm the only Laird Scranton on Facebook, and happy to answer people's questions. If they're reading a book and have a question or a comment or a critique or a different idea, I'm happy to hear all of that.
Okay, great. Well, Laird, this has been a whirlwind for me of information, and if you're up to it, I'd love to have you back on for a part 2 sometime in the future.
Sure, and meanwhile, if you are mulling on any of this and have questions, contact me, Facebook message me, and I'll be happy to walk you through something.
All right, I certainly will take you up on that.
Okay, because if you can't bring it down to a why, you don't have anything.
Ain't that the truth? Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.